In the summer of 1816, the sun disappeared. Not metaphorically, not as a mood, the sun literally disappeared from the skies over Europe for most of that year. A volcano had erupted in Indonesia the previous spring, Mount Tambora, the largest eruption in recorded human history. The ash cloud it sent into the atmosphere was so vast that it blocked sunlight across the northern hemisphere for months. Crops failed, temperatures dropped, skies turned red and purple at midday. People starved. History calls it the year without a summer. A group of writers decided to spend it in a villa on the shore of Lake Geneva. One of them was 18 years old. She had just lost a child. Her name was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, not yet Shelley, and she was about to write the novel that would invent an entirely new kind of story. You know the creature, you know the name. What you probably don't know is what was actually happening in that villa and what was happening inside Mary's mind in the weeks before she put the first words on the page. Because Frankenstein is not a monster story. It never was. It is a story about what happens when you create something and then abandon it, about the violence of being brought into existence without being wanted, about a maker who cannot face what he has made. Mary Shelley knew all three of those things personally before she wrote a single word. Let's go back to the beginning, not 1816, further back. Mary was born in 1797 in London, the daughter of two of the most radical thinkers of the age. Her father was William Godwin, philosopher and political anarchist. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, the woman who had written A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, the foundational text of modern feminism. Her mother died 11 days after she was born. From childhood, Mary grew up beside her mother's grave in St. Pancras churchyard. She learned to read by tracing the letters of her mother's name on the headstone. The woman whose ideas had shaped an entire generation was to Mary an absence, a name on stone, a mother she would never meet. Her father remarried. His new wife did not want Mary. The household became a place where Mary was tolerated rather than loved, brilliant, isolated, and acutely aware that her very existence had cost her mother's life. She was 17 when she met Percy Shelley. Percy was already married. He was also one of the most celebrated young poets in England, radical, charismatic, completely convinced of his own genius. He and Mary began a relationship that scandalized everyone who knew them. They eloped to Europe in 1814, taking Mary's stepsister Claire with them. Mary was 17. She was pregnant within months. The first baby died. It was born prematurely in February 1815 and lived 11 days. Mary was 17 years old when she held her daughter for the first and last time. She wrote in her diary 2 weeks after the death that she had dreamed the baby was alive, that they warmed her by the fire, and she lived. That dream stayed with her. By the summer of 1816, she and Percy were back in Europe, traveling toward Lake Geneva. Claire had begun a relationship with Lord Byron, the most famous poet in the world, possibly the most famous person in the world, and Byron had rented a grand villa, the Villa Diodati, above the lake. The party that gathered there that summer was extraordinary. Byron, Percy Shelley, Mary, Claire, and Byron's personal physician, John Polidori, who was 20 years old, deeply insecure and desperately trying to prove himself to a group of people who barely noticed he existed. The weather made everything worse. The volcanic ash had turned the Geneva summer cold and grey. Rain came constantly. The lake churned. They were trapped inside. Byron read to them from a German collection of ghost stories one evening, and then, almost as a joke, almost as a game, he proposed a competition. Each of them would write a ghost story. The best one would win. Percy started something and abandoned it. Byron wrote a fragment about a vampire, which Polidori later expanded into the first vampire story in English. Polidori himself wrote something quickly forgotten.
Mary had nothing. For days she had nothing. The others asked her every morning what she had come up with. Every morning she had to say she hadn't thought of anything yet. She was 18 years old in a room full of the most celebrated literary figures of her generation. She had no formal education. She was not married. She had already lost one child. She had no name of her own in that world. She was Percy's companion, Byron's guest, Claire's stepsister. And she could not think of a story.
What happened next she described herself in the introduction she wrote for the 1831 edition of the novel, 15 years after that summer. She described the conversations she had listened to in the Villa Diodati, Percy and Byron talking late into the night about natural philosophy, about the experiments of Erasmus Darwin, about whether it might be possible to reanimate dead matter, whether electricity might be the force that distinguished living flesh from dead. She went to bed one night, unable to sleep after one of these conversations, and in that state between waking and sleeping, she saw it. Not described, not imagined, seen. She saw a pale student of the unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. She saw it stir. She saw the student, horrified by what he had done, rushing away, hoping that the thing would fall back lifeless, that the spark would fail. She saw the student fall asleep, and she saw the creature, standing at the bedside, looking down at him with yellow eyes, with a gaze that contained everything it had not been given. She opened her eyes in the dark of her room in the Villa Diodati, and she thought, "What terrified me will terrify others." The next morning she began to write. What she wrote in the weeks that followed was not what the competition had asked for. It was not a ghost story. It was not a horror story in the way Byron meant when he proposed the game. It was a question, the question she had been living with since she was born. What does a creator owe to what they create? Victor Frankenstein brings his creature into existence through obsession and ambition. He looks at what he has made and cannot bear it. He runs, he abandons the creature in the moment the creature most needs him, the first moment of its existence, when it wakes alone and confused and reaches out for the person who made it. The creature spends the entire novel trying to find someone who will see it, not love it, just see it. Mary had spent her entire childhood trying to find someone who would see her in the same way. Her mother was gone. Her father was present, but distant, consumed by his work and his new wife. She had grown up beloved in theory, daughter of two radical thinkers, surrounded by books and ideas, and profoundly alone in practice. The creature is not the villain of Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein is. That was the radical claim of the novel, and it was a claim that only an 18-year-old girl who had felt abandoned by the person responsible for her existence could have made with such absolute certainty. The novel was published in 1818. Mary was 20 years old. It was published anonymously, with a preface by Percy, which led most early readers to assume Percy had written it. The idea that an 18-year-old woman had written it was, for many people, simply unthinkable. The first review in the Quarterly Review called it a work of wild and vigorous imagination. It also expressed concern about the philosophy it contained. The reviewer was right to be concerned. The philosophy it contained was dangerous. Not dangerous in the way they meant, dangerous because it asked who was responsible for the suffering of the created, dangerous because it put the monster's perspective at the center of the story and made it impossible to dismiss. Here is the detail you will repeat to someone tonight. Mary Shelley was the only person in the Villa Diodati who actually completed the ghost story competition. Percy's fragment was never finished. Percy's attempt was abandoned. Polidori's vampire story was written later separately. The competition that produced Frankenstein was won by the youngest person in the room, the only woman, the only one without a literary reputation,
the only one who had to convince herself for days that she had anything worth saying. She was 18 years old. The novel she wrote that summer has never gone out of print. It has been adapted more times than any work of English fiction, except perhaps Shakespeare. The creature she invented that night in the Villa Diodati has appeared in over 50 films. Its face is one of the most recognizable images in human culture. She wrote it because she could not sleep. She wrote it because she had listened to two famous men talk about creation and felt something they had missed. She wrote it because she had been created by someone who died before she could be known, and she understood, in a way neither Byron nor Percy ever could, what it meant to exist without the person responsible for your existence. Frankenstein is not a story about a monster. It never was. It is a story about what every person who has ever felt abandoned by the one who should have loved them first already knows. She just found the words for it before anyone else did. If that changes how you read the creature, leave it in the comments. I read them. And if you want to keep reading between the lines, the next story is already waiting.